But the other thing I would like to talk with you about, because this is another topic that I'm just surprised that it is not talked about more, given the amount of international transactions that we're having today. And again, international exchanges that are increasing at exponential value, and yet are not necessarily integrated with the cultural exchanges. By living in both Asia and the West, and by living in different countries and continents and cultures, I noticed that there are extremely radical differences, both in the cultural norms, let's say, but also under the lens of narcissistic behavior, in the way that, for example, narcissistic tendencies and trends and behaviors are encouraged or discouraged in different cultures. And it is sometimes, I have to admit that sometimes it is mind-blowing, because I feel like I have to live in two completely opposite realities when I deal with people in the West and the East, due to the fact that some tendencies that are completely encouraged and seen as heroic, if you will, and a representation of great values in one culture, are seen as demonized and criminalized in another culture. Somehow I have to figure out a way to integrate all of that. So please take the floor. Again, I'm sure you have a lot of expertise on the topic, and I would love to hear your opinion and research on it.
First of all, it's important to make a distinction between the hidden text and the occult text, and to revisit works by Althusser and others who've dealt with some of these issues. Althusser, of course, ended up crazy in a mental asylum, like Nietzsche before him and many others. I think when you see the world as it is, this is a serious risk.
Yeah.
So there is a overt text and hidden text. The overt text is the globalized West. Western values, such as, for example, capitalism, growth, economic growth, democracy. Ironically, you have elections everywhere. You have elections in China also. You have elections in Russia. This is a Western import. So, but this is, of course, the overt text, the text that is not deconstructed, the text that is misleading, superficial, and teaches us nothing about the nature of reality. It's a text that is self-referential. It's a text that refers to itself, but never to reality. It has no, connotations, denotations. I'm not going to it right now. So the overt text is Western values, and I would say even much more so Western lifestyle and Western ideologies. But the overt text is, of course, irrelevant. What is relevant is the occult or the hidden text. And the hidden text in each and every cultural sphere, is, of course, dramatically different, but I think can be divided in two major groups. And there is a lot of work that's been done on this by the likes of Caponi and Roland and Theodore Millen, the late Theodore Millen and others. And they suggested that you could divide the world basically into collectivist societies and individualistic societies, where the emphasis is on the individual and where the emphasis is on the collective. Now, the Renaissance when I say Renaissance, I'm talking actually starting in the 12th century, not necessarily, not so much. But the Renaissance was the cult of the individual. And because it was the cult of the individual, it came out with various manifestations of individualism that we are suffering to this very day. I regard the Renaissance as one of the most deleterious, detrimental, and destructive intellectual movements in human history. It gave rise, for example, to the personality cult, Niccolo Machiavelli and the Prince. It gave rise to totalitarianism. It gave rise to malignant individualism. The Renaissance gave rise directly to fascism and Nazism. There's a direct lineage there. And I will not go into it right now, but we could dedicate a whole another maybe talk to it. But so it is the Renaissance that introduced the idea of individualism. The very concept of authorship, the auteur and the author, these are Renaissance inventions. Prior to that, art was basically a collective endeavor, a collective effort. You don't know the names of the artists in ancient Egypt, not one of them. So this is a new, individualism is a Renaissance thing. And then you have societies which, luckily for them, were not affected by the Renaissance because they were too far away, like Japan and China and so on and so forth, and they're collectivist society. Narcissism exists in both individualistic societies and collective societies because it is part of human nature. However, it manifests, it expresses differently. Whereas in an individualistic society, the individual would take credit, would boast, would brag, would make claims about accomplishments which are counterfactual, would lie, would, you know, everything would revert to the locus would be the individual. So the individual, an individual athlete may say, I trained a lot, I worked very hard, and I accomplished this. An individual Nobel Prize, individualistic Nobel Prize winner would say, you know, I spent all my life studying this chemical reaction and then I succeeded. Suddenly, with inspiration, I succeeded to this and to do that and so on. In collectivist societies, you would have the same narcissist. But a collectivist athlete would say, I want to thank my coach and the support of my team members, without which I would have never accomplished this. And a collectivist Nobel Prize winner would say, in our laboratory, which is one of the best in Japan, we succeeded to break this enigma which other laboratories all over the world failed to do. These are both narcissistic, grandiose expressions, but they relate to the collective. A worker in a corporation in Japan, a salaryman, as they call it, you know, in Japan, would be proud to belong to that company. He would derive his sense of grandiosity from the fact that he belongs to that company, that he's part of this collective. Whereas as chief executive officer of a similar competing company in the United States would make it all about him. He was the visionary. He came up with new ideas. He implemented new procedures. He. Even very often nonsense. He didn't do anything. But so narcissism is all over the world. There is not a nook or cranny or angle or that is free of narcissism. No such thing. Arab societies, Asian societies, African societies, Western society, they all have narcissists. But there are legitimate and non-legitimate ways of expressing narcissism. And so each society structures speech, structures what informs the individual, what is legitimate speech and what is not legitimate speech, and sometimes even penalizes non-legitimate speech, as we have seen, for example, during the COVID pandemic. So you pay a very high price if you use non-legitimate speech. If you belong to a white supremacist militia in the United States and you're proud of it, you're very likely to end up in prison. So even if you're a collectivist by nature and your grandiosity is the outcome of belonging to the group, you may end up in prison for this. If you're a neo-Nazi, for example, in Germany. And similarly, if you're too individualistic in Japan, you are likely to attract very negative attention, which could end very badly for you. And there were a few actors in Japan who were put in prison because they were too individualistic in many ways. And so they were accused of sexual assault and other things and so on. So there are permissible speech acts in every society, and that's the only difference. Nothing substantial, nothing fundamental, and nothing clinical is different. It's the same narcissism. Just the way you talk about it. It depends, you know, is responsive to your culture.
Yeah, exactly. The way I see it is that it's almost like when you have a flow of water and you close the flow in one spot, so the water flows in the other spot. So
Yes.
in a similar way, whatever the society permits, whatever it encourages and it allows, that's where you're going to see those traits coming out. So in my personal experience, and it could also be due to and then we could even explore the topic on how technology on Eastern and Western, how differently it is being applied and it's influencing culture, because that's another, we could, that's another book that could be written on. But the way I see it being expressed here, for example, in Asian cultures a lot more, is what most people would define as covert kinds of narcissistic expressions, as opposed to the more overt ones that are more encouraged and promoted and accepted in Western cultures. So I'm seeing much more of the, as you said, for example, with the example of Japan, if a person were to brag too much about their own accomplishment here, they would be immediately seen as shameful by the society. So it is not encouraged at all to do these kinds, to promote these kinds of behaviors, which are instead encouraged in Western societies. But at the same time, when a person self-sacrifices to great degrees, even to the detriment of everybody else around them and themselves, but that is because it is a very collective value, self-sacrifice and selflessness and just giving, working for society, because that is considered such a high value in this society. There is a lot of these narcissistic tendencies of doing all of that, so in order to get the attention, to get the approval, to get, the adulation and so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
it's
I would like to. I know that you haven't been using clinical language in what you've just said.
oh
You've
yeah,
been
exactly.
using
Yeah,
you've
yeah,
been
you
using
can.
colloquial language, which
Yes,
is okay.
yes, yes.
But I would like to comment, because some of these words have clinical meaning, and if I don't correct the record, it could be.
Please
So, for example,
correct away.
covert. The word
Yes,
covert
yes.
has a clinical meaning.
Mm,
It means a narcissist who is unable to obtain narcissistic supply, unable to garner attention,
mm.
and therefore becomes bitter, seething with envy, and passive aggressive. We call it a collapsed narcissist. So I wouldn't use the word covert in, for example, when we describe collective or collectivist narcissism. So in a collectivist societies, an overt narcissist, not a covert narcissist, would brag and boast as much as Donald Trump does, but he would brag and boast about the collective, about belonging to the collective, or being an integral part of the collective, or enjoying what the collective has to offer. Or so this, it's still a grandiose, overt narcissism. Just there are permissible speech acts and non-permissible, socially unacceptable and frowned upon speech acts. So I wouldn't use the word covert, it's a bit misleading. What you describe at the very end of what you've said is known as prosocial narcissism. There is a variant of narcissism who is communal. It's a narcissist whose grandiosity is about how altruistic he is, how charitable, how compassionate, how amazingly caring, how flawless, how righteous, how so this kind of narcissist does good deeds but then brags about it. His good deeds are ostentatious. They are visible, public. Everything is done in public. There's no private sphere. And so we call this kind of narcissist prosocial narcissist. For example, probably Mother Teresa is an
Yeah.
example. And maybe Greta Thunberg is an example. So these are people who are essentially highly narcissistic, and they externalize, they create a facade of look how pro-social I am, not antisocial, exactly the opposite. Look how beneficial and benevolent I am, and magnanimous and amazing and moral and ethical. And I would even say the locus of the superiority is in the morality. I am more moral than you. It's competitive morality. And sometimes there is competitive victimhood. I'm much bigger victim than you are. My abuser is much worse than your abuser. I've been hounded by the CIA much more than you did. So it sits, there is a seamless integration with paranoid ideation as well. So paranoia, victimhood, pro-social, ostentatious, pro-social and communal narcissism, they very often go in hand in hand. And then you see a pro-social narcissist who says, I'm a very moral person. I've never done anything wrong. I'm righteous and so on. And because I'm like that, everyone is attacking me. Everyone is hounding me. Everyone is, and I'm a victim. So you have a smooth transition from a pro-social claim, narcissistic claim, to victimhood, to paranoia. Smooth integration. So all these are nuances of pathological narcissism that unfortunately get lost online.
Yes, yeah,
People make
absolutely, yeah.
people make a huge mess between psychopathy and narcissism, and
Yes, yeah, yeah. Exactly. And I'm sure I also sometimes confuse the terms. And yes, it's a communal narcissism. That's the more accurate term to describe these tendencies that I observe very intensely in Asian cultures and not as much in Western cultures. And it's
I agree.
really amazing sometimes how extreme one of these tendencies will go in a culture where it is so accepted and promoted and valued. So to the extent of incredible levels of self-sacrifice, incredible
Yes.
levels of victims, and so on and so forth, because it is part of the value system of the culture. And so that's how the narcissistic traits can come out, hidden as goodness and being a good part of society and so on and so forth. So thank you so much for the correction and the clarification. And so we probably don't have that much time left. I don't want to steal too much of your time, although I could really talk about this for hours, but
Don't worry
maybe
about my time, but the attention span of viewers is likely to
yeah,
dwindle
we lose
dramatically.
them. We might lose them eventually.
Yeah.
So, but is there, okay, so I will leave the last minutes to you for if you have anything you would like to add about
No,
this.
I much
Uh,
prefer to be led. I'm a very
okay.
submissive type. So,
Okay.
as you may have
So
noticed.
all
So,
right. So even though we could really honestly have another entire conversation on this, but would you like to touch upon the subject of how technology is impacting Eastern cultures versus Western cultures? Because that is another topic that I think very relevant in the way that we are shaping society today and the world. So,
one common misconception is that technology creates or generates or engenders social trends. I am not aware of any technology ever in human history that has created a social trend, not even the printing press. And I can go into details what I mean and so on, but to generalize, I'm not aware of such a. I am aware, however, of numerous social trends that gave rise to technologies. Um, and so when you ask the question, how is technology leveraged, accepted, and integrated and assimilated in various cultures, what technology would do is to amplify these cultures. Amplify. Now, one could argue that quantity becomes quality. And if you amplify something sufficiently, you create something new. That is an interesting argument. That is an interesting argument. For example, you have narcissism, and then social media come and they amplify the narcissism. The narcissism was there, nothing new, but having been amplified, maybe we are faced with something relatively novel, something that a kind of narcissism that has never happened before. So this argument has its place, of course. I think um, technologies amplify narcissism and to a large extent psychopathy, whereas in Eastern societies, I think technologies amplify cohesion and compliance. I don't want to say obedience. I don't want to say slavishness. I don't want to say submissiveness, although in some countries definitely that's the case. But shall we say conformity? So technologies there would encourage conformity because they homogenize. These technologies homogenize huge numbers of people. again, there is one thing I keep saying, and people people hold me to task for it. I keep saying that modern technologies are totally reactionary. And they're reactionary because they lead us back to the past. They lead us to the village. And they lead us, for example, to homogenization. Initially, there were television networks, and these television networks captured 80, 70, 80, 60% of the audience every single night. In many countries, 100% in every single night. Even in the United States, there were 3 television networks, and between them, they captured close to 80 or 90% of the audience. So there was essentially homogeneity. And then what happens? Cable television came. Cable television fragmented the audience. It fractured the audience. Okay? And then social media recreated the homogeneity of the public. Again, recreated it. That's another example of a reactionary trend, going back to the past.
Yeah.
So today, you have identical experiences. It's true that you are exposed to different posts and different images and different reels and different views, but you are within the same platform. It's the same platform. It's like watching NBC or ABC. It's true that on NBC, you could see a basketball game, you could see a soap opera, you could see the news, and it's true. Internally, the content shapeshifts and so on, but you are in hoc and you are inside a single platform, and the algorithm of the platform homogenizes. It's an algorithm that homogenizes, regrettably, leveraging what we call negative affects like envy, anger, fear, and this creates even more homogeneity. So when you take social media and other technologies, by the way, you mentioned artificial intelligence, multiplayer games, which is a fascinating topic. So multiplayer games are complete, solipsistic, self-contained, self-enclosed spaces, alternative realities. You can definitely go into the game and never exit because you can buy things, you can trade things, you can get married, you can work, and the metaverse is the idea to expand multiplayer games and to include your workplace or your grocery store or your pizza parlor or whatever. So when you take these technologies and you superimpose them on Eastern society, let's call them Eastern, or the Southern and Eastern societies, which are essentially collectivist societies, the homogeneity built into these encourages conformity, encourages obedience, so in the East, when you take the very same technologies and you superimpose them on the West, what you get is homogeneous individualism. Everyone thinks they're special, everyone thinks they're unique, but they're special and unique in the same way, in predetermined ways. The algorithm limits you 100%. It's a single thoroughfare. It reminds me of Chaucer and the pilgrims, There are many types of pilgrims. There's this and there's that, and they disagree and they hate each other and they fight and so on, but they're all walking the same road, the same, and this is a Chaucerian scene. Western individualism is the ultimate form of conformity. This is what Western people fail completely to understand. Their rebelliousness, their defiance, their individualism, their contumaciousness, they're in your face, I'm special, I'm unique, and this is all channeled and predetermined. It reminds me that when you work with certain softwares, they give you a choice of templates. Then you choose a template. It's like choosing a template and saying, you see how unique I am? I chose this template. Yeah, but the template is predetermined. This is the mother of all conformity, You can't create your own template. You have to choose one of the templates. And yesterday I wrote something. I said that actually, let me get it right, okay? I wrote something which kind of captures what we're talking about. Hold it for a second. Be patient. And here's what I wrote. If the cage is sufficiently large, it creates the illusion of freedom.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
When the enclosure is adequately provisioned, it is misperceived as home. That's what I wrote yesterday.
Mm, mm,
And so we have individualistic conformity and collectivist conformity, the same way we have individualistic narcissism and collectivist narcissism. It's the same thing. It masquerades differently. It expresses, manifests differently. It reminds me that in biology, you have genes. You have a gene. And the same gene fulfills several functions very often, depending on combination with other genes and so on. But the environment sometimes determines whether a specific gene is expressed or not. This is known as epigenetic expression. So the environment is, and it's the same here. You have conformity, and the environment tells you how to express your conformity, and you think you are being an individual. You know? So in Japan, the environment tells you if you want to express your conformity, you have to do it through the collective, and by belonging to the collective, you would feel special and unique and so on. And in the United States, they tell you if you want to express your conformity, you have to do it by being an individual and claiming individuality, but you can claim individuality only in these prescribed ways, which is a total oxymoron, total contradiction in terms, you know? And of course, I'm not the first one to say this. Sartre, of course, discussed the issue of authenticity and how authenticity is extremely close to impossible especially in Western society. He gave the example of the waiter in a cafe. The waiter comes in, changes his clothes, and becomes a waiter, and so on and so forth. So I'm not the first to suggest this, but it is relevant to your question. It's the same phenomenon, masquerading differently, but it's the same. Don't think that there is any fundamental difference between Japan and Texas. None. It's just that in Japan, the same phenomena are expressed one way, and in Texas, definitely a very different way. But it's the same phenomenon.
mm. Brilliant, brilliant answer. And this really helps to sort of wrap everything around. And aren't the things that we're least aware of the ones that control us the most? So it is almost an oxymoron that because we believe we're so free, that is what actually ends up making us so enslaved. So yeah, nothing hides better than in plain sight. Well, thank you so much for this very insightful and very interesting and fun conversation. And again, I could really talk more about these kinds of topics. So if you want to come back anytime, I would be happy
No,
to give you
it's up to
another.
you. I told you I like to be led. It's
Okay.
up to you. I'd be happy
I
to talk to you again if that's what you're
yeah, I
saying.
mean, I have a lot of these kinds of questions that we could go into, so
With
we can
pleasure.
definitely. So thank you so much for your time. Would you like to
Thank you
share
for having me.
also, obviously I will put your information under the video that I published. Would you like to share anything about how people can reach you, what kind of books about you that you wrote?
Just Google Sam Vaknin. I have a YouTube channel, and I have a zillion websites. I've been one of the first on the internet, so I'm all over the
Yeah,
place. Yeah. So
yeah, no.
just type Sam Vaknin, and you get everything you need.
Okay.
Okay?
Any final words, anything you would like to say to the people who are willing enough to listen all the way to the end of this conversation?
Disengage.
Mm,
The reality right now is manifestly and totally toxic. I cannot see a single redeeming feature in reality nowadays. For your own sanity and for your own survival, perhaps atomization is not such a bad thing. And avoiding contact with people, There is a debate whether we are truly zone politikon, we are truly social animals. I doubt, I have my doubts. I think we are not social animals. I think the concept of the idea of society is very new and a bit counterfactual. It's very new, definitely. The first time anyone discussed society was in the late 18th century. Exactly like childhood is a very new concept. It's 150 years old. So the idea of society is very new. And every new idea creates an ideology, and every ideology interpolates you, like Althusser said. Every new ideology forces you to behave in highly specific ways and to think in highly specific ways. Don't. It seems that this attempt to create an organizing principle and a hermeneutic principle, explanatory principle, in the form of society, this idea of society, has failed. Has failed. Early Enlightenment figures, including, of course, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and others, they hinted that it might fail. Even the great believers in society, like Adam Smith and Hobbes, even they, had their doubts. I think we've reached a breaking point where the concept of society, the idea, the organizing principle, has failed completely. We need now to protect ourselves from others. Others represent a threat. All others. Your nearest and dearest and closest are no exception. And the only way to protect yourself is to create an inner world that is rich enough and supportive enough so that you can somehow survive in the only virtual reality which is healthy, and that is your mind. Your mind is a virtual reality, of course. So don't look outward for solution. Don't look for example, for a virtual reality out there provided by Zuckerberg, but look inwards. You have everything you need, everything it takes. You have all the resources from the moment you're born. We come fully equipped. And so if the environment and so-called society and so on, the world has failed you, you feel free to withdraw and to avoid and to wait it out. I know this is an exceedingly unpopular message and might be even construed as mentally unhealthy message because we have, for example, schizoid personality disorder, avoidant personality disorder. But these disorders are value judgments. To say that someone is avoidant and to pathologize it is because avoiding is perceived to be not good, not okay. That's not a clinical entity. That's a value judgment. So feel free to be schizoid and avoidant because
Okay.
the alternative is increasingly more dangerous
Yeah.
and threatening.
Yeah.
That's my message. And that's what I do in my personal life.
Well, thank you for this very, very valuable final words. And yeah, I have to say I resonate a lot with your message. And anyways, fortunately, I never get tired of still trying, trying my best to do whatever is possible up until the day that I'm out of here. So hopefully something good will come out of it. Thank you so much again for this conversation, Dr.
Thank you.
Vaknin. I'm very honored to have had you here and to have this wonderful, insightful topic
My
discussion.
pleasure.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for having me. I appreciate it. And thank you for suffering my long answers.
No, it's okay. It's
Take
my
care.
pleasurable. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording now, and